What if I told you that in March 2023, the entire global money system had a heart attack, and nobody even noticed? While you were scrolling through your phone, the most powerful currency in human history quietly died. But here's the twisted part. It's still in your wallet, looking perfectly normal. Let me show you exactly what happened on the day the dollar stopped being real money. March 15th, 2023, remember that week? Most people think it was just about some tech bank in Silicon Valley going under and a Swiss bank having problems. The news made it seem like a few reckless bankers got what they deserved. Nothing to worry about, right? Wrong. What actually happened that week will be written about in history books. 50 years from now, as the moment America's dollar transformed from real money into something completely different, a survival tool controlled entirely by the government. Now, the dollar didn't vanish from existence. It's not like your cash turned to dust. What died was something deeper, something most people don't even know exists. The basic rule that made capitalism work, the idea of real collateral backing up our money, was thrown out the window. And it happened because the United States had to choose between letting the system collapse or breaking the rules to stay alive. They broke the rules. Let me explain how we got here. For the past 80 years, the entire dollar system stood on one foundation, U.S. Treasury bonds. These bonds were considered the safest thing you could own on planet Earth. Think of them as the ultimate IOU from the American government. Here's how the game worked. If any bank anywhere in the world needed cash, they didn't have to beg for it. They just showed up with a treasury bond and said, "Here's my collateral, lend me money against this." Everyone accepted it because everyone agreed these bonds were rock solid, super easy to sell, and properly valued by the market. But then 2022 happened. The Federal Reserve started jacking up interest rates from basically 0 all the way to 5% because inflation was going crazy. And here's where basic math becomes a nightmare. When interest rates shoot up, the value of old bonds crashes down. Picture this, a 30-year treasury bond that was issued back in 2020. Paying just 1.2%. Interest was suddenly worth only 60 or 70 cents on the dollar by March 2023. That's not just a number on paper. That's a real, massive hole punched through the balance sheet of every bank, pension fund, and foreign country holding American debt. So by early 2023, the entire banking system was technically broke. They owed depositors 100 cents for every dollar. But the assets backing those deposits were only worth 70 cents. It was a ticking time bomb. March 10th, 2023, the bomb exploded. Silicon Valley Bank completely imploded, and people started pulling their money out. But this wasn't just a run on one bank. This was the beginning of a run on the entire U.S. government debt market. Think about what would happen if every bank had to sell their treasury bonds at 70 cents to pay back depositors. The entire American banking system would have been wiped out by Monday morning. We're talking losses bigger than all the capital in the entire U.S. financial system combined. The Federal Reserve had a choice to make, and they had to make it fast. Option 1. Let the free market do its thing, which meant complete banking collapse and another Great Depression. Option 2. Destroy what makes the dollar trustworthy just to save the banks. They picked option 2. Sunday, March 12th. The Fed announced something called the Bank Term Funding Program. Sounds boring, right? Like some technical banking stuff nobody needs to understand. But hidden inside this program was a single sentence that literally ended free market capitalism in the bond market. Here's what they said. We will lend money to banks using their treasury bonds as collateral, but we won't use the market value of 70 cents. We'll pretend they're worth 100 cents, the full amount, just because we say so. Read that again, slowly. The Federal Reserve openly declared they would value something the entire market said was worth $70 as if it were worth $100. Not because of any economic reality, simply because they decided to. In that exact moment, honest pricing died. The value of the U.S. dollar was no longer decided by what people were actually willing to pay. It was decided by whatever number the central bank wanted to write down. They literally created $30 of fake value out of thin air for every $100 of collateral. It was a secret bailout of the entire bond market, hidden inside boring banking language. But why is March 15th specifically so important? Because when the crisis jumped across the ocean and broke one of the most important banks in the world, Credit Suisse. While the Fed's program stopped American banks from collapsing, the global panic was already spreading everywhere else. Credit Suisse was incredibly important to the worldwide dollar system. On March 15th, their biggest investor, the Saudi National Bank, announced they wouldn't help anymore. The stock price crashed. But the panic that followed wasn't really about bad management at one Swiss bank. It was about everyone suddenly realizing that the global dollar system had run out of real collateral backing it up. The Swiss National Bank freaked out. They had to save Credit Suisse or the whole system could collapse. But here's the problem. The Swiss can print their own currency, francs, but they can't print dollars. So where did they get the dollars to bail out Credit Suisse? From the Federal Reserve, through something called swap lines. In other words, on that day, the U.S. Federal Reserve basically became Switzerland's central bank. They flooded the entire global system with dollars to cover up the fact that the collateral underneath everything was rotten. And this is where countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and Russia had a terrifying realization. They watched the Fed's program and the Credit Suisse bailout and understood that the game was completely rigged. Here's how. If you're a foreign country holding U.S. Treasury bonds and you need to sell them, you have to sell at the market price of 70 cents. But if you're an American bank holding the exact same bond, you can trade it to the Fed for 100 cents. The United States created a two-level system. Level 1, American banks and close friends who get special treatment and protection from bad decisions. Level 2, everyone else who has to eat all the losses from the Fed's money printing. This was the moment the old petrodollar deal spiritually died. And it's no coincidence that, in this exact same week of March 2023, the news was filled with something unprecedented. Saudi Arabia and Iran, longtime enemies, making peace with China's help. While the West was frantically trying to glue its broken banking system back together with fake numbers, the East was building a completely new energy system. They realized that holding U.S. debt was no longer safe because the U.S. government had proven it would change the rules whenever American banks got in trouble. The supposedly safe investment had become a guaranteed loss. Here's the most sneaky part that almost nobody noticed. Because the Fed didn't call this money printing or quantitative easing, the inflation alarms didn't go off right away. They called it a liquidity injection. They said it was a loan, not free money, but the mechanics were identical to printing cash. By letting banks turn their losses into full value, the Fed pumped hundreds of billions of phantom dollars into the system. This is why the stock market, especially tech stocks and AI companies, skyrocketed in 2023 and 2024 even though the actual economy was slowing down. The market smelled the new money. Smart investors figured out that if the Fed was willing to backstop the bond market with fake prices, then nothing would be allowed to fail. The Fed put was back. But this time it wasn't just protecting stocks. It was protecting the very foundation of the entire ledger. The Fed's program proved that the U.S. government will always choose inflation over admitting defeat. They will always choose to make the currency worth less rather than let the assets of wealthy people show their true value. This realization shattered the psychological trust in the dollar. Before March 15, 2023, you could argue the Fed was seriously fighting inflation, that they were tough like Paul Volcker in the 1980s. After March 15, 2023, it became crystal clear that they're not Volcker. They're like the Weimar Republic printing money, just wearing nicer suits. It was like getting diagnosed with terminal cancer. The patient is still walking around, spending money, looking normal. But inside, the collateral chains holding the global economy together have started transforming into something deadly that can be reversed without completely resetting the entire system. The immediate aftermath of the Bank Term Funding Program wasn't a return to confidence. It was a quiet, terrifying confirmation among the world's smartest money managers that the United States had basically nationalized its bond market. By agreeing to value failing assets at full price, the Federal Reserve introduced a fatal flaw into the machinery of global capitalism. In a real free market, Failure is what cleans out the system of bad debt and stupidity. If a bank makes terrible decisions, buying long-term bonds right before interest rates explode, it's supposed to fail. Its assets get sold off at market prices. The smart banks buy them for pennies on the dollar. This creative destruction makes sure money flows from the foolish to the wise. But on March 15, 2023, the Fed announced there would be no destruction, creative or otherwise. This destroyed the concept of risk within the U.S. system, but it massively increased it for everyone outside the system. To a central banker in Beijing, Brazil, or India, the message was unmistakable. The U.S. dollar is no longer neutral money. It's a political weapon that will be devalued to protect American institutions at the expense of foreign holders. If the Fed prints $1 trillion to backstop this program, that inflation gets exported. This is taxation without representation on a global scale. Foreign creditors are paying for American bailouts through the invisible tax of currency devaluation. This realization triggered the great return to gold. For 50 years, Western financial experts taught that gold was outdated. It paid no interest. It was heavy. It was old-fashioned. The sophisticated asset was the U.S. Treasury bond, which paid interest and was backed by the superpower. But after March 2023, the equation flipped. If backed by full faith and credit means we'll change the accounting when we re-losing, then that credit is worthless. Central banks started looking for an asset with no counterparty risk. An asset that's not someone else's debt. An asset that can't be printed by a panicking committee in Washington. In the months after the banking crisis, we saw the most aggressive central bank gold buying since 1967 when the London gold pool collapsed. China didn't just buy gold. They vacuumed it out of London and Swiss vaults. Singapore, Poland, India, Turkey followed. They weren't buying paper gold, futures, or ETFs. They were buying physical bars and bringing them home. They were taking delivery. This is the behavior of a lender who knows the borrower is about to default. They're cashing in their paper chips, the treasury bonds, and taking the real poker table, the gold, home with them. This shift marks the end of the petrodollar era and the beginning of the petrogold or commodity currency era. Now that treasuries are only worth 70 cents unless you're an American bank, the deal is broken. We're seeing the rise of fragmented settlement. Oil is now being traded in Chinese yuan. It's being traded in Arab dirhams. It's being traded in Indian rupees. But these currencies are just middle steps. Nobody wants to hold rupees for 30 years. The ultimate settlement asset for these trades is increasingly gold. China is basically saying to Saudi Arabia, accept our yuan for your oil, and you can immediately convert that yuan into physical gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. This bypasses the US dollar entirely. It creates a closed loop, oil, yuan, gold. The US military can control the oceans, but the Fed can't control this trade settlement. By weaponizing the dollar system through sanctions and debasing it through this funding program, the U.S. has pushed everyone to create parallel financial plumbing that's immune to American leverage. Hundreds of U.S. banks are technically bankrupt. They're the walking dead. Their loan books are full of commercial real estate loans that will never get repaid and treasury bonds that are underwater. But because they have access to the Fed's lifeline, they don't close their doors. Instead, they exist in suspended animation. They stop lending to the real economy. They become hoarders of money rather than lenders of money. This is exactly what happened to Japan in the 1990s. Their lost decade was caused by refusing to let bankrupt banks fail. The U.S. has now turned its entire financial sector Japanese. Small businesses, the engine of the American economy, are finding it impossible to get loans because local banks are paralyzed by their hidden bankruptcy. The credit crunch we're seeing now and will continue seeing is the direct result of the fake stability, purchased in March 2023. The Fed saved the banks but sacrificed the economy. This zombie status is driving deposit flight. Smart depositors, corporate money managers, and wealthy families know the banks are zombies. They know that FDIC insurance of $250,000 is a joke in a high inflation environment. So money is fleeing from banks into money market funds? This drains liquidity from commercial banks, forcing them to rely even more on the Fed's emergency programs. It creates a vicious circle. 1. Banks are weak. 4. Fed prints more to support them. 5. Inflation rises. 6. Depositors leave faster, chasing higher returns. The endgame of this loop is nationalization of all deposits. Eventually, the private banking model becomes impossible, which means the government controls all credit. If the government guarantees the liabilities, they'll eventually demand control of the assets. The death of the dollar as a market instrument leads inevitably to the birth of the dollar as a tool of total government control. The central bank digital currency. The CBDC is the only technological solution to a banking system that can no longer survive on market principles. If the banks are zombies, the Fed must become everyone's bank. March 15th, 2023 was the moment the mask came off. It revealed that the free market is a fantasy that's only allowed when prices are rising. When prices fall, the market gets suspended. The so-called rules-based international order only follows rules when those rules favor the country that prints the reserve currency. The billionaires moving to Dubai saw this. Central bankers in the developing world saw this. They're not declaring war on the dollar. They're buying Bitcoin. They're buying farmland. The tragedy is that the American saver whose pension and life savings are in these political liabilities has no clue that the foundation of their wealth was liquidated 3 years ago. They're still counting their paper, unaware that the game has changed from who has the most dollars to who has the most real assets. The death of a reserve currency is almost never a single explosive event. It's a long, painful process of rotting from the inside out like termites eating a house. On the surface, the paint looks fresh, the walls stand tall, the roof holds. But inside the support beams, the structural strength has been eaten away. This is the condition of the American middle class today. They look at their retirement accounts, their home value, their bank balances, and they see numbers that look reassuringly high. They don't realize these numbers are measured in a unit. The post-2023 dollar, that's been fundamentally compromised. The wealth they think they have is a nominal illusion being sustained only by the accelerating devaluation of the currency itself. This creates the most dangerous economic environment in history, the inflationary melt-up. Most people prepare for crashes. But in a government debt crisis, the market often doesn't crash in dollar terms. It crashes in real purchasing power while rising in dollar terms. Look at the stock market in Weimar Germany in 1923, Zimbabwe in 2008, Venezuela in 2016. In local currency, these stock markets were the best performing in the world. They went up 1,000%, 10,000%, 1,000,000%. Did investors get rich? No, they got wiped out. Because while the stock market went up 10,000%, the cost of bread went up 20,000%. The rise in asset prices was just reflecting the collapse of the currency. The U.S. is entering the early stages of this dynamic. When the Fed signaled with this program that it would print to save the bond market, stocks rallied. If you own Apple stock, you own a piece of a real company with real cash flow. If the dollar loses 20% of its value, Apple's stock price should theoretically rise 20% just to stay even. The stock market has become an inflation hedge rather than a growth vehicle. The tragedy is the average person sees the Dow Jones hitting record highs and thinks the economy is thriving. They're celebrating the devaluation of their own labor. This brings us to the silent default. The U.S. government has $36 trillion in debt and over $200 trillion in unfunded promises, Social Security and Medicare. There's mathematically no way to pay this back in honest money. They have two choices. 1. Honest default. Tell bondholders and retirees, sorry, we're broke. You get 50 cents on the dollar. Political suicide. 2. Dishonest default through inflation. Print the money to pay bills in full, but make sure that money buys half as much. Political survival. They've chosen option 2. This means for the next decade, your savings are under attack. You're being targeted by financial repression. The interest you earn in your bank might be 4%, but the true inflation rate, including housing, food, and insurance, will be 8 or 10%. You're losing 4 to 6% of your buying power every year. It's slow motion theft of wealth that is invisible to people who don't understand what is happening. The government is stealing your retirement not by taxing it, but by diluting it. So how do you survive in a house being eaten by termites? You have to stop storing your wealth in the wood, paper currency, and bonds and start storing it in the steel, hard assets. The traditional portfolio of 60% stocks and 40% bonds is a death trap in this environment. The 40% in bonds is basically dead money. It's a guaranteed real loss. The bond market has transformed from a safe place into a certificate of confiscation. The new portfolio must be a barbell strategy. On one end, you hold zero counterparty assets. This means gold, silver, Bitcoin, productive land. These are assets the Fed can't print. When dollars lose value, these assets reprice higher. They're the lifeboats. Notice none of these have a CEO, none have earnings reports. None rely on a government promise. They get their value from physics, gold and land, or mathematics, Bitcoin. In a world where political promises are worthless, physics and math are the only things you can trust. But the most critical adjustment is psychological. You must abandon the money illusion. Stop measuring wealth in dollars. If your house goes from 500,000 to 600,000, you feel 100,000 richer. No, you're just holding more units of a dying currency. Start measuring your wealth in ounces of gold or Bitcoin. Priced in gold, the U.S. stock market has been flat or down for 20 years. Priced in gold, the average American wage has collapsed since 1971. When you change what you're remeasuring against to something honest, the illusion of prosperity vanishes and the reality of decline becomes clear. This clarity is painful but necessary. It forces you to stop chasing yield, risky bets to make 10%, and start chasing preservation, owning things that can't be diluted. The events of March 2023 were a warning shot. The system cracked and they patched it with duct tape and money printing. They bought time. But they didn't fix the structural problem. Too much debt, not enough real collateral. The next crisis will be bigger than Silicon Valley Bank, bigger than Credit Suisse. It'll likely involve a sovereign country or a globally important bank. And when that happens, the Fed won't just print billions. They'll print trillions. They'll implement yield curve control, capping interest rates to prevent the government from going bankrupt. That's the end game. When yield curve control arrives, the dollar enters its final phase of rapid devaluation. The death that happened in 2023 will become a funeral in 2026 or 2027. The people who are prepared, the ones holding the steel, will survive the collapse of the house. The ones still trusting the wood, holding cash, bonds, and annuities, will find themselves standing in rubble, wondering where their life savings went, even though the statement still says they have $1 million. The dollar didn't die with a bang, it died with a bailout. And now you know the truth. The question is, what are you going to do about it before the rest of the world figures it out?